So welcome to all the people present with us, but also the people who are joining us online, virtually, from their homes or wherever they are, on this day, remarkably sunny in Amsterdam, touching really the reality of our climate change as well, just outside of our doors. Within this festival, we are critically questioning and examining the ability and of shape-shifting, perhaps, and accommodating and adapting to our new realities of ecological, technological, and cultural radical change that we are facing. And in today's session, we have two guests with us, joining us both virtually and physically with us in space. And our session is called Melting Mind and Body, on breaking boundaries with embodied art, activism, and the psyche. My name is Hilda Moucharrafieh, and I'll be your host, and very happy to be joining you here, and would love to thank as well the technical team and the entire team of Fiber Festival for putting this together. So I'd love to acknowledge as well their work on this. To introduce today's talk, which will be mostly on the categorical thinking, I'll read this paragraph to you. Many of the ecological and social problems the world faces today can be traced back to thinking and acting in divisions and categories. Just as there is a separation between nature and culture in Western thinking, there is a clear separation between the mind and the body, known as the mind-body dualism. This puts us in all kinds of problematic situations, separating the impacts of our actions from a holistic reality. So in this session, joining us, Camille Chaparral and Victoria McKenzie remotely, which love to consider as change makers who are active on the crossroads of embodied art, activism, and the psyche. What can we learn from them and the fight for systems change and building of new communities? Camille, if I may introduce you before we begin the presentation. Camille is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, DJ, and embodiment researcher who uses Afrofuturism to imagine creative interventions towards systems change. Their practice weaves dance, ritual, film, sonic healing, and cultural production. Camille is the artistic director and main booker for Emergent Bass, an event series celebrating the Afro-diaspora influence in electronic music and underground club culture. They also serve ritual bass as DJ Afro on Kali, playing a hypnotic blend of low-end frequencies and polyrhythms, which honors the healing potential of bass music. In 2020, the Amsterdam-based artist directed The Grief Portal, a sci-fi-inspired short film commissioned by Performing Borders Live and Counterpoint Arts, exploring how grieving can be generative. Camille's work also featured in the VPRO documentary, The Post-Racist Planet. They are the head of Ecologies of Transformation, a temporary master's program at Sandberg Institute, exploring how art making and embodiment can facilitate social change. Camille also works as an advisor for MAPS, ensuring that psychedelic-assisted therapies will be accessible to global majority communities most harmed by the war on drugs. So please welcome with me Camille for the first presentation of today's session. Welcome.
Thanks. It's good to be here. My session today is called Repatterning Cartesian Dualism, Growing Embodied Approaches to Social Change. So I want to start with a quote from someone who's very dear to me and dear to my thinking, has shaped a lot of the ways I think and see the world, which is James Baldwin. And I really resonate with this quote. History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us, we are our history. I think this is incredibly important when we're considering the moment that we're in, where living in individualist societies, we sometimes think that we're really free, we don't carry any baggage, we just make the decisions we make. When I tend to think, like James Baldwin, we are a product of our ancestors, of the legacies they've lived, of the systems they've birthed, and we are very much kind of living and reproducing a lot of those dynamics. And so in order to really take stock of where we are now and work out how we move to somewhere else, I think we have to get a bit more comfortable with understanding our history and how things have led to this moment. Which brings me to the main subject of my presentation today, which is Cartesian dualism. Hilda already mentioned this mind-body split, and this is just another way of speaking to that. Many of you are probably familiar with René Descartes, a very pivotal kind of European philosopher, and he really developed his thoughts in the 17th century, disseminated a lot of ideas that really underpin Western rationalism, a lot of the ways our societies have been structured. And his ideas also really justified colonialism and continue to justify globalization and the ways the global north continues to dictate the economic development of many other parts of the world and our ideas of progress and development, very much underpinned by rationalism. I'm sure you might be familiar with the very common quote, "I think, therefore I am." And this is a really key notion of Cartesian dualism. He felt that the only thing he could be sure of were his thoughts. Now, the only thing that seemed real, this kind of mental consciousness. He doubted the reality of his body. You know, he said, maybe my body's an illusion, but my mind is real. And so Western rationalism and this kind of Cartesian dualism idea is really about prioritizing our minds, seeing our minds as the essence of who we are, and really devaluing the body, saying that, oh, the body doesn't really have any intelligence. It's just this kind of meat suit that carries around our consciousness, our mind, that is who we are. And so really seeing this separation between mind and matter, and also creating a lot of different categories that result from that. So also seeing humans as separate from nature, saying that all these kind of fleshy physical things aren't really real. We're not going to give them the value of being kind of sentient. We're going to say that we're actually very separate from the natural world. And with that, you also have this idea that reason, rational thought, thinking is then superior to natural processes, to nature, to embodied emotions or sensations. And this kind of thinking has really underpinned a lot of the way the Western medicine is structured as well. We focus on the body as constituent parts rather than a holistic whole, as you see in Ayurveda or in Chinese medicine, other medical systems that have a more holistic approach. And with Cartesian dualism also is this idea that animals are inferior to humans because they don't have the same mental faculties, they don't have consciousness in the way that humans do. And so there's this kind of hierarchy, this system of levels of importance that kind of classify the world based on this thinking. And this is a map by Rupa Maria. I'm going to speak a bit more about in the next slide. I suppose is one way of conceptualizing some of the impacts of this thinking, the legacies and the dynamics of hierarchy that have been a result of having much of the world structured under this way of thinking. So you have the colonial project, which developed a lot from the kind of Enlightenment era out, and many argue is still ongoing in terms of extraction of resources from the global south, the way that globalization perpetuates certain ways of thinking in quite a dominant, hegemonic way. And so you can see from colonialism, this has kind of created different forms of supremacism or different forms of dominance, one of which is white supremacy, or systems of racism or racial hierarchy in their different manifestations around the world, male supremacy or patriarchy, human supremacy, so the idea is that we should be dominant, have dominion over the earth, and everything other two-legged kin and animal kin should be beneath us. We see the ways that this has led to different forms of bondage, whether that's human enslavement, different forms of genocide. We can see ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples and land grabs that are still happening today as we speak. Invisibilized labor and the ways that so many people around the world are kind of facilitating the lifestyle that we lead in the West. Femicide, ecocide, and exploitation of resources more generally, which kind of underpins capitalism as the economic model that we live within. And all of this leading to trauma and inflammation of various sorts, whether that's the inflammation of the planet, also our bodies as individuals, cancer being a more and more widespread illness in the West, which is very much related to inflammation of the body as well. So I want to show this to kind of just situate some of the hierarchy, some of the dynamics that have kind of become a legacy from Cartesian dualism and lots of ways of thinking in the Enlightenment period, which we're still kind of living within and have to kind of orient to in order to arguably understand how we move through and beyond this into something else. So this book I highly recommend. I'm digesting it really slowly, haven't completely finished it yet, but this has been written by Rupa Maria, whose map I just showed you, and Raj Patel. And the book is kind of going into detail, to more detail, showing the connections between the web that I just showed around colonization and these different processes of harm that we're now living in and often sometimes viewing in silos, right? We say we have the climate crisis and many of us just focus on that as if it's not connected to capitalism. Or we focus on dismantling patriarchy without looking at how colonization and the gender binary, which was really a very recent construction, also links to colonization and that kind of period of the Enlightenment. So this book goes really deeply into it, and I highly recommend it for those who want to get into the detail a little bit more. But a big takeaway that I have from this is noticing that an individualist approach to systems change or to health and well-being in any form, or healing in any form, is futile because we are so interconnected. There are many people right now who I suppose subscribe to kind of wellness industries and things that I guess selling us the idea that if we take as many supplements or go on these retreats, somehow our health will be maintained. But in reality, this is a farce, because if our waterways continue to be polluted, if our soil continues to be depleted, if we're polluting the air, eventually no amount of money is going to protect us from that. We have to start thinking about collective approaches to health and well-being, and to notice how that's very much related to our planet, to the life-sustaining practices that our planet generally has, and was more abundant before these kind of interruptions of colonization. But also looking at the ways that the toxicity we put into the earth, whether in industrial farming, for example, ends up coming into our foods, creating inflammation in our bodies and creating more and more illness. So no longer having this kind of siloed approach, but putting it all together and acknowledging how our history has got us to this moment, and also giving us a map of maybe what we have to repair or move away from in order to go somewhere else. So circling back to Cartesian dualism, what is exciting to me in this moment as someone that thinks a lot about embodiment is we're starting to see Western science kind of catch up to what many indigenous cultures have known for a very long time, that there is no separation between mind and body. A book that many of you might be familiar with, and if not, I highly recommend, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, came out in 2014 and represents a lot of really new neuroscience that's demonstrating that different forms of trauma are not just sort of impacting our brains and shifting the way our brains operate, but completely impact our bodies and shift the shape our bodies take, but also our perception of the world, our ability to read our surroundings, to engage in day-to-day reality. So our bodies are really implicated with trauma, and what Bessel's work demonstrates, having worked with PTSD, veterans with PTSD for over 3 decades now, is that embodied interventions such as yoga, therapies such as EMDR, actually are most effective at repatterning this trauma. So working with the body is also a pathway to repattern the trauma that comes into the body. Many indigenous communities have already many practices that kind of integrate this. So there's a book I've cited here as well, Dancing Wisdom by Yvonne Daniel, which looks at the role of ritual dance practices in many Afro-diaspora communities and religions in kind of communing with ancestors, healing, but also connecting to nature, connecting to the flows of life. There's also a whole movement now of somatics. Many of you might have heard this term that's often based on or kind of developing ideas that have been first accessed in Eastern traditions or African traditions, but now creating a kind of westernized research area that's connecting many people to these practices and how we can kind of engage with our bodies. Then there's also the exciting field of epigenetics, which is looking at which genes are kind of switched on or off, depending on the experiences our ancestors have had and the environments we're living in. So there's a lot happening in the scientific realm that's finally acknowledging this information. So I think we're starting to develop some pathways out of it, but I think it's important to name the dualism, the initial split, so that we don't lose that on the wayside and start to fit these ideas around something without getting to the root cause. Alongside this research in neuroscience and traumatology, you have a whole movement based around embodied social justice now that's also developing, which I'm very grateful to be part of and learning and in conversation with many people such as Ray Johnson, Stacey Haynes, who've written these incredible books which are really combining a lot of the social justice work or activism people have been doing for many years and showing how that relates to embodied trauma, to access to healing. And a lot of the focus of their work, I would say, is they're trying to express that it's no longer that useful, maybe, to focus just on policy or legislation change alone. Because social power, inequality, and systems of oppression are enacted through our bodies on a daily basis. So if we think about, wanting to change racism or ableism, and we're just thinking about, oh, well, if we change this policy, that will work, that will do it. It doesn't prevent any future government from maybe just reverting that. And so as embodied social justice approach is talking about how do we actually shift the way that bodies relate, whose bodies we see as valuable, whose bodies we see as being entitled to be in leadership, or whose bodies we see as being subordinate. Who do we think is safe? Who do we think is dangerous? And really working on that relational field, because if that changes, then that supports change that's lasting in our laws, but also in just how we create culture, create new culture together. So I think this is another important development and something which I hope crosses over into different forms of social change work. This kind of on this topic of embodied social justice, someone whose work I look into a lot as well is Albert Morabian, who did a lot of nonverbal communication research. And his work kind of can be broken down into looking at how we track communication. And overall, we're communicating about 55% of the messaging we're receiving is just body language alone. 38% is tone of voice. Only 7% are the actual words we say. So again, if we're trying to dismantle racism, for example, we can be so focused on, oh, but did they say something that was racist? Did they say it? Not about how people are treating certain bodies who have different color skin or different ethnic backgrounds. So we really need to also look at the relational piece, because so much of what's being communicated and reinforced in our societies is not just about what people are saying or writing down. It's about how their bodies are engaging with other bodies. So the last piece to talk about, and then I'm excited to hear Victoria and Hilda and see where this conversation is going to go, is Ecologies of Transformation, which is a master's program I've curated, and I'm leading at Sandberg Institute and working with a really wonderful group of 12 people. And the question we're kind of researching together is, how can embodiment and art making facilitate social change? So really trying to combine what may have seemed disparate, at least in a Western sense, and maybe move more towards a remembering for many of us that have ancestral lineages that are only recently disconnected from our indigenous practices, but trying to remember what these kind of holistic rituals could look like that allow us to create social change, not just through policy external to us, but starting with ourselves around how we relate to the world and each other, and thinking about how that can shape our communities to change and the wider world. So we can also see this as a spiral or even a fractal, which is something Adrienne Marie Brown talks about a lot, also with her work on emergent strategy, which draws on chaos theory, and thinking about how we can start to make very small shifts in our communities, trusting that that actually ripples out and creates change in the larger framework as we are all interconnected. So it's a very exciting moment, and I'm curious to see what we explore together. But the main thing that feels helpful to me anyway is that we're experimenting and noticing that the legacies we've been born into are not working, are not serving us, and we really need to be creative and curious about how we can change the way we relate to hopefully create some new paradigms and become good ancestors that are leaving behind a world that may be hopefully inhabitable and a nourishing space to be for the future generations to come. So I'm going to end with a quote from another dear ancestor, Audre Lorde, which is that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. So by returning to the body, by practicing something that goes against this logic of Cartesian dualism, we hope to use different tools and different practices that can create holistic change. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Camille. Really appreciate how you had connected the individuation back to the Cartesian dualism that is neither, like you say it in a way that to repattern that it's not only to focus on policy change alone, so it's not only changing the system, there's returning to authority, that authority will impact the society, and is not the going to the wellness center, is neither. It's not that it's our individual responsibility in this kind of consumerist care, but something in between, seeming like hinting towards a communal, relational practice. So I'd like to keep that there. We will keep as well like questions for the end of the panel after Victoria's presentation. Can you hear us, Victoria?
Yes, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes, very well. If I may introduce you, Victoria, before we move on to your presentation.
Perfect.
So Victoria McKenzie is an eco-warrior, academic activist, dance artist, choreographer, and writer based in London. She is currently a PhD candidate at UCL, University College in London, where she works at the intersections of ecofeminism, Black study, post-colonial thought, climate discourse, and philosophies of being. Victoria has worked with various organizations on the connections between art, politics, and ecology, which includes forensic architecture, Amisacho Restauración, ICE Institute for Creative Exchange, Ajayi Associates Architecture, and Dance Makers Center for Creation. She also teaches an MA course called The Ecological Self, based in the Ecologies of Transformation department at the Sandberg Institute. And in 2019, Victoria traveled to the Ecuadorian Amazon to utilize her background in both permaculture and mycology, where she acted as project lead and consultant for ongoing fungal mycorrhizal projects of toxic soil and oil spills caused by the Chevron Texaco on indigenous lands. Exciting, Victoria. Let's see if you can plug in your presentation.
Perfect. There we are. Okay. So before I begin, I just want to thank FIBA for this fantastic festival and also the opportunity to be on a panel with someone that I truly admire and respect, which is Camille. And I'm constantly surprised at how we can always invoke the same spirit within our individual languages. So this gets me excited. So my talk today is Mutation as Invitation, Living in and Within the Relation. And I really want to dive into this idea of mutation that was presented through the festival provocation. And there was a theme or a quotation that I enjoyed, which is, next slide. Mutation can be seen as an unwanted development, but might also present opportunities to change habits and minds. In the face of a planetary emergency, the Western societies will need to leave behind their untenable separation from nature. Mutation explored and practiced as the blurring of separations could provide us with both speculative and actionable modes of moving towards a new existence. And when I first read this, it made me think about this idea of working on the micro and the macro. And there's a specific type of mutation that I think is operating in the world today that loses its understanding. So I'm going to focus today on the mutation of carbon and the reinterpretation that I think needs to happen. Sometimes we become so enthralled or so taken by this speculative aspect of carbon that we forget where it came from. And we forget where a lot of these mutations come from, which is a site of a relationship. And one thing that the Western industrial system does is that it likes to make us think that these things are just things, or products are just products, objects are just objects. Because when we think in that particular mindset, it's easier to commodify and to consume the object rather than to see it connected within an entangled world. For example, it's easier to consume oil than to recognize that oil is actually a relationship deep within the earth between algae and zooplankton that took a mass amount of time to create. And it's easier to consume sugar than to recognize its colonial history, that being this coming together of two interesting elements, which is the simplification of nature in the form of the plantation and the simplification of the black body in the form of the slave. So when we see things outside of these entanglements and outside of these relationships, we can't empathize or connect or understand with what's truly taking place. And we can't recognize from this connected strand that there's an entanglement operating in the world because the system wants us to see the commodity, the object, or the mutated. So in the mutation of carbon, I'm specifically speaking about its movement into carbon dioxide. And the speculative rhetoric around climate change is that this thing we see all over the media is this imagery of disaster and forest fires, and that creates a kind of fetishization of the disaster itself, and it loses the opportunity to understand how carbon gets to carbon dioxide. And so in this way, that's a bit of an invitation, mutation to invitation. So first, I think we need to ask the question, what is carbon? Next slide. Everything that has a material existence in this world is carbon. Carbon is actually an essential material of all life forms. And if you are a living being, you have these carbon molecules because it acts as a building block or the backbone of all life. And it basically provides structure or form. Human bodies are made up of about 12% carbon, and we also consist of about 19 other elements like hydrogen, oxygen, iron, potassium. And these elements are all cycling through us all the time and into our environment, which also challenges this idea that ecology isn't something external to us, and we are always at all times connected to the world. So whether these life forms take in carbon to help manufacture food or release carbon as part of respiration, or even, for example, processes like carbon-14, which is pivotal to the practice of archaeology because it's only released at death. So you're actually able to determine the age and the time of certain fossils and species based on its release. So this intake and this outpour of carbon is a component of all plant and animal life. And not only is it the fourth most abundant element in the earth, but in the universe. So carbon is everywhere. And like all elements of life and nature, it's in constant movement from place to place. I mean, one of the things that we're doing in Ecologies of Transformation is that the students and I were creating this vocabulary together based on what we observed through nature, what these characteristics were. And one of them was movement and continuity, this constant movement. And anytime there is stasis, that's when there's a problematic. Next slide. So carbon is stored in rocks and soil and the ocean, plants through processes like photosynthesis, which creates a type of cycle. So that's the movement and continuity taking place. And the cycle begins and the cycle ends and the cycle continues. And I would argue that when there is a system that sees both its beginning and its ends, that creates something whole and holistic. And the imbalance is when we cannot see its beginnings nor its ends. So in that diagram there, for example, those red numbers are human figures or human causations. And what you see is a linearity, right? It's not a closed cycle. So although you can see, for example, this continuity of photosynthesis as an interaction or a site of a relationship in which carbon, for example, moves from soil to plant to atmosphere and even human within a particular space, in the image which shows the human causation and the line going straight up, that's a process of combustion and extraction. So it's creating something linear, not cyclical, and therefore that's what I would call imbalance. Next slide. When we extract oil or we burn fossil fuels, it's not just a matter of saying, oh my gosh, greenhouse emissions, climate change, red alert. Because what's really happening is that we're moving something from the site of a relationship, like I said earlier, this relationship deep within the earth, which is an ancient cycle. And we're placing it into territory where it now has to fend for itself and seek balance elsewhere, which has other effects on the surrounding environment. So now the colloquial notion of the butterfly effect becomes very real. The disaster that happens on one place of the earth creates a fatality on the entirely opposite side. So carbon from deep within the earth is now removed and released into the atmosphere, where it's not only in an imbalanced state because it's out of its relationship, but it's in an excited state. Thus it bonds with oxygen, the closest material, and it creates carbon dioxide. And the rate we're doing this extraction is a rate that's both pulling on an excess to create a surplus and making it even more difficult for carbon to re-enter this natural and ancient cycle, therefore creating the linearity, creating something outside of a relation, creating this carbon dioxide that's both excited and heated. And that's what we have, what's called this greenhouse gas, which is the gas is now within the atmosphere, outside of its cycle, in the excited state, warming the globe, thus global warming. I also think that it's not this uncontrollable state of global warming or climate change. And it's not just a matter of saying that humans are emitting carbon dioxide at this uncontrollable state, because when we say things like that, I think, one, there's no accountability. Because remember, it's not humans per se that are the problem. It's a particular type of human system, that being this capitalist system with its roots in colonialism. And two, if we can't interpret the real problem and provide accountability, then we can't think or imagine a real solution, which is why I believe that going back to this pivotal, seemingly simplistic moment, like what I just presented, which was very much grade 8 science, provides us this opportunity of rereading and reviving carbon in order to see this entangled element moving through the world seeking balance, because in so many ways, so am I moving through this world seeking a type of balance. Next slide. So in a very real and practical sense, what got me fascinated in starting this work was looking at the Fukushima 311 nuclear disaster. And I was so, first of all, interested by this notion of fatality, this idea that the nuclear explosion happened and there's nothing we can do about it. And much like the mutation is an invitation, I find fatality also to be an invitation and almost something to reject, because I don't think it's over till it's over. And I think given sufficient time and support, the Earth has an amazing ability to remediate and to heal. It's a question of asking, what is our role within that healing? And within Fukushima, which experienced the explosion of its nuclear power plants, there's radiation everywhere within the prefecture, to the point that it's become uninhabitable. And radioactivity, much like the greenhouse gases, are also in these excited states, these mutated states. And it's seeking a type of balance, so it's easily looking for things within its environment to bond to find this balanced state, which is why, for example, radioactive cesium, which came from the nuclear disaster in 2011, can be found in bluefin tuna off the coast of California nearly 10 years later, because it attaches to molecules in the water, it's ingested by the fish swim all around the ocean, it's ingested by the human body, where the radioactivity attaches to cells and causes mutations like cancer. So these disasters are never exclusive to the disaster zone, and they're entangled in their formation, but they're also entangled in their violence. And they're entangled to the point that they not only have these ecological implications, but these violent implications within and amongst human societies. For example, the communities that once lived within the prefecture have to relocate entirely, and they can no longer do agriculture or even live in that space because of the radiation. And not only did they protest the power plants from even being within these communities, but they recently protested the 2020 Tokyo Olympics because the government turned the Fukushima prefecture into a summer game space where these communities once lived. So once again, you're seeing how government continuously chooses economy over life. And then two, these nuclear power plants in the Western world are often funded by uranium and yellowcake mining from spaces within Africa, such as Niger. And it's usually done through illegal labor, where all sorts of violent acts takes place within the camps. And it further solidifies this neo-colonial aspect, where once again, the Western world is living off of the labor of its African and Black communities. Next slide. So what you're seeing in this image is the governmental intervention. And time again, we see how government always takes up these elaborative and performative and, quite frankly, expensive infrastructural interventions. And because the prefecture had radioactive soil everywhere, they decided the best point of action would be to scrape the surface of the earth and place it in garbage bags, and then place those garbage bags in mountains and simply wait for the radiation to wear off. And not only is this done without the communities, but it's done without a recognition of how the earth actually works, or even an understanding of how nature actually works. So what you're seeing in the mutations of both carbon or the mutations of radiation is that the mutation came from a site of a relation. And these environmental disasters were all caused by neoliberal economy, not people. Therefore, there's an accountability, but also this recognition that if the violent act is entangled and connected, and the formative act is entangled or connected, then the remedial or the healing act must also be entangled and connected. And what I mean by that is we need to come together as human and more than human communities to recognize that if we are to heal this planet, we have to do it in community as a planetary community of this earth, as all inhabitants within this earth. And I really believe that when we start to reinterpret the mutation as an invitation, we can get back to this point of seeing things as sites of relationships, and we can inhabit and find life there. And that's how we get to the notion of a cycle and the return to a cycle. That's what people usually speak about when they say carbon sequestration. What they really mean is placing carbon back into a space in which it can cycle, like the soil or like the ocean. And what becomes clear is that if nature is really operative on these series of relationships, which is very delicate, then not only are we a part of this, but in order to heal and work with this healing, we have to start seeing these entanglements. And if carbon sequestration is placing the carbon back into cycles like the soil, then not only is that a type of healing, but our own healing becomes inhabiting and aligning with that cycle. So putting this into practice, I want to give an example of having done the work in the Amazon, and how in 2019, when I was working with these indigenous communities on the problematic of toxic soil caused by oil spills by Chevron Texaco in the 70s, which is wild because can you believe that they're still living with the travesties of disaster today from these spills caused in the 70s? First of all, here's another representation of environmental disaster being caused by neoliberal economy. And secondly, there wasn't just an extraction of oil taking place within the region, but also a mutation. They took oil, which is a natural substance or relationship found in the form of hydrocarbon within the earth, and brought it to the surface. But through this practice, or through this extraction, there was a malpractice taking place within the extractive process, which caused oil spills throughout the region. And not only did this cause problematics like toxic soil and water, which meant that they could no longer do agriculture, but the toxic substances were also causing many cases of cancer within the human body. And when I was speaking to one of the activists and farmers there, his name's Donald Moncoyo, an amazing man, he told me that what made them realize that the cases of cancer were connected to the oil spills was that they started to see the animals get sick first. And they really just thought cancer was a natural part of life, because Chevron Texaco, once they came in and created roads and started their practice, they told the communities that oil was medicine and said that they can rub it on their skin. So that's what they were doing. So not only did this cause, like I said, cancer, the toxic soil, they couldn't do agriculture anymore, but these extractive processes, through a process called combustion, creates the burning of natural gases, which produces a flare. Next slide. Slide after that. And something that I noticed while I was there is that if you go to one of these sites in which the flares are present, right underneath the flare, it's a death zone for insects. Next slide. And the problem with that is the insects are so attracted to the light of the fire that really important pollinator species fly into the fire and they die, which has implications on the forest, because now another cycle is being disrupted, which is the cycle of the seed. That's how the seeds get transported through these pivotal members of the insect communities. And so now again, you're seeing how the community is affected, these more than human worlds are infected, the environment is affected, and violence is creating this entangled act. Next slide. So within working within this space, it was a question of asking how can remediation be applied here? How can healing be applied here? And just like Camille was just saying in her talk, that we need collective approaches to health and well-being, and there needs to be a type of multiplicity when we're working with healing, because we're working on different scales. That made me think about the mushroom and fungi. And in working with the toxic soil, we have to understand what remediation was, and how remediation itself is actually a form of translation in the way that the disaster is a mutation. And if you're working with this notion of translation, what could the mushroom translate? Fungi works in a way that it allows the processing and breaking down of really difficult materials like the hydrocarbon molecule from soil to become something smaller and translatable for the uptake of plant roots and soil communities. So with the fungi, you don't have hydrocarbon, you now have hydrogen, water, and carbon, which are two simple elements that can enter a cycle once more. And fungi, specifically the mycelium, which is the vegetative body of the organism, is where all the complex chemical processes and breaking down takes place deep within the earth. And the mushroom that we see on the surface is actually the fruiting or the floral body, and this is what spreads the spores or the seeds and feeds insects and organisms, and it also has a type of functionality. But in working with the fungi, specifically oyster mushrooms, there had to be a recognition that because disaster is an entangled act, it wasn't about coming in to implement this practice, but working within this triad of relationality where you had the environment in these more than human communities, you had the human indigenous communities, as well as the individual body. Next slide. And so because the oil spills were causing all these cases of contamination and cancer within the communities, we had to utilize the fungi in a way that the way that it works in the soil, it can also operate within the human body. So we created reishi and medicinal mushroom tinctures that in essence remediate the human body. And you could think of it this way: where a vitamin would enter your body based on a certain prescription or to target a specific symptom or an organ, the mushroom enters on the basis of becoming conversational or dialectical with the immune system. So if your immunity is too high, meaning you have lots of allergic reactions, it's hyper aware, it would just lower it. And if it's too low, meaning you get sick a lot, it will just raise it. And so it's always in conversation based on what translation needs are happening within that time. It's flexible, which is, I think, something that needs to be incorporated within our current society and the current construction of our institutions at large. But also, it wasn't just about acting on the soil or within the individuals, but also within the communities. Next slide. We wanted to teach the communities how to grow these amazing species and what mushroom species were already native to the forest and how this closed system actually works. And it's also recognizing that this wasn't about going in and cleaning up, because I think that's also a type of colonial mentality, but it's about asking quite literally, how can this cycle continue when I die? How can the cycle continue when I leave? How do I recognize that I am both a small actor and a connected actor within the cycle? Next slide. I think that when we get back to seeing these sites of relationality and seeing these interconnected strands that allow us to connect seemingly isolated events and defeat the binaries created in the event, then we move into different ways of being and new systems that are decentralized in the way that nature acts as an interconnected and decentralized mode. And these new systems connect us to our more than human communities. So on one level, we hold these corporations accountable. And then on another level, we remediate and we heal the destruction. But what I think is most important within this cycle of revelation and remediation is that restoration and relationship is also revealed. And the site of the relation, which is everywhere present, doesn't only show us how connected the disaster is, but how connected we are. And I think when we start seeing things in this way, that's when we see these new entanglements, these new modes of being, these new systems that can emerge for the type of the world that we'd not only like to think of together, but to feel and imagine together as an earthly community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for this very rich presentation and of entanglements as well with from tiny molecules of carbon and how they enter in all different ways of in the ecosystems. I'd like to see if there's first any questions from the audience or elaborations and remarks, or if you'd like to add something on Victoria's presentation, Camille.
I think I'm still digesting. It's very rich, and I'm just always, really happy to hear your practice and the connection points. So thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have any first questions or remarks from the audience here present? We can pass on the mic. into the mic? I guess also for our online audience.
Thank you. Hi, welcome for the wonderful. Thank you for the wonderful festival and these beautiful presentations from both of you. I'm also still digesting, just as Camille. But one thing that came up is one of the last thing you mentioned, Victoria, was decentralization, and we see most of like activities of decentralization happening in the crypto technology world today. At least that's what's most known, what's like big. So, but here we're talking about this entanglement, right? And I don't know, the crypto world is for the big community known as a financial structure. We know that like crypto technology has moved to a next generation where we can also like decentralize social contracts or even legal contracts, rendering useless governments in a sense. So it's a question to both of you. How do you see this new technology emerging as maybe a tool to cause a more worldwide decentralized entanglement as I don't as a new form of like organizing ourselves as human species with our surroundings and the planet. I don't know. I'm rambling a little bit here, but it's what keeps me thinking. So I would like you, if you could comment on that, it would be wonderful. Thanks.
I can jump in maybe. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I have very mixed feelings about cryptocurrency generally because it seems to be reinforcing a lot of the same dynamics. But what I think is interesting about the blockchain and about the movement generally is that it hopefully can show people that the current economic system we have is very much created also. So I think for a lot of people who don't understand crypto, they'll say, but it's not really real. I'm not going to invest in something that isn't real. Like fractional reserve banking isn't real. You know, money hasn't been tied to gold since the 1970s. It's not weighted against anything and continues to just be printed when needed. So to me, the most exciting thing about crypto is hopefully that it gives an example of how we can create different resources, different community structures that can hopefully allow us to have a bit more agency to design on a decentralized level the types of systems we might want to live in. And so that part excites me. But yeah, I don't know if that lesson is necessarily very available right now, especially as sort of more traditional financial institutions get into crypto and start using the blockchain as well. So there's a kind of weird consolidation that's happening with those power structures. But yeah, I think we need to be, or I hope people will start to be quite experimental and inventive around how to do things on a more community level that connect to other communities in the world as well, and not needing to maybe be so reliant on government structures as we've known them, to hold them accountable, but also to have more agency to create the things we need and that we want. And I think there's a lot of promise as well with worker cooperatives, community land trusts, and people, you know, within the system that we live in, sort of taking back a little bit more control and seeing what can be created from that. So that's just what comes to mind when I hear your question. But yeah, thanks.
Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. No, just going to jump in on that, Camille. I completely align with what you're saying there. And it's funny because when I think about decentralized modes of action, or decentralization as its characteristics of nature, and I was saying earlier that in the Ecologies of Transformation course, we kind of worked with this new vocabulary, and it wasn't just about recognizing that decentralization was one of the characteristics, but there's also notions of movement, continuity, and flexibility. And so I think if we're going to reinterpret our systems on the basis of decentralization, then we also need to consider a flexibility and a continuity, and within our communities, how we're going to be in constant dialogue. So when we're forming these new institutional systems and places or spaces, it's not about creating something or permanent or static, because we are completely different beings at completely different moments and times and temporalities. So maybe it's about saying at one moment we are this and we will do this, but then on the next moment we have to check in about something else. In the way that our institutions today, for example, are so against death or the end, but these small births and these small deaths are so embedded within systems. For example, within the university, contracts begin and end, students come in and out, things are always changing. So why are we trying to cement things like law and policy? I think there needs to be a constant checking in, and that happens in the space of the community and these cooperative spaces, because the co-op is so connected to the converse, to the conversational.
We have the mic running around if anybody in the physical space has any question or response to that. Or further, please go ahead. No, please.
Thank you both for this wonderful talk. So during this lecture, I wrote down this question is, where do we start to create a more embodied social consciousness in times where the ego has taken over, knowing that the ego is also a product of a surviving strategy? So my question from a point of a maker is how and which artistic practices can actually help dissolve that ego and create a more like embodied consciousness.
Thank you for the question. There's a lot in there. I'm going to try and just pick out some threads that are coming up. I think with embodiment, we really need to practice. With anything we want to change that isn't already how we live, it needs repetition. So I think we need to, if you're interested in it, I would suggest really starting on yourself and developing a practice which you're hopefully eventually doing every day and deepening into it, because I think we're also living in a time where people might start something, try it for 6 months, and then they start selling themselves an expert on it. And we're like, okay, now I'm going to teach you courses in this. And it's like, I think getting into the practice ourselves and continuing to lean into it, I think is a big part of it. And to notice the shifts and how we can be with discomfort and be with more and more sensation. I know for me, I've still got a lot to learn about it. I feel like I'm in my very early stages of embodiment exploration. But in terms of the arts, I think one thing I notice is that it's still very much an industry that's structured around individualism and around competition. Even the way that art institutions are structured, it's around, creating artists that are going to be at the cutting edge of something and are going to be able to have compete in the market. And this is a real departure from the role of arts in a lot of indigenous communities, where art is about reinscribing cosmology and a sense of knowing and a sense of belonging. It's about relationship again, whereas the Western art world is very much around finance and capitalist competition. So I'm thinking this moment is interesting for artists to consider, what's it for? Like, yes, it might be interesting to continue to deconstruct everything and to, just have these intellectual escapades. But what's it really for? Like, if we want to create a new world, how is art in service of that? How are we creating more access for belonging, for shared understanding, rather than continued abstraction out of a sense of, well, it's our right as individuals to do it. Of course, great, you can do that. But is that going to create something different? Or is that just going to lead us down more of the same? So I hope there's more of a reckoning around the role of art, and to interrogate that rather than have this continuous, very laissez-faire approach of, well, we have the right to just make it about anything, rather than understanding the power of it to actually be about shared connection and belonging to create culture. Because the deconstruction is a culture, as much as we might see it as neutral, it's not neutral, it's very political. So that's my hope. Across all disciplines, I don't think it's maybe just one, but I think it's more an approach of how art is structured in the West currently.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's also a very pertinent question and very personal and vulnerable. It also touched something within me, and where I, especially as what you mentioned, the ego, which I would argue is also not one, but several egos that inhabit us, that you label it as coming as a survival, or like it instigates a survival agency within us. And referring back to Victoria's talk, what is it actually that we're trying to overcome or survive? Is there a space for healing as well, to recognize what we are trying to overcome and survive, and use that as, how did you say it in the beginning, Victoria, as a blurring and allowing for a mutation as well, and welcoming into these, like this mushroom, which already perhaps contains a lot of the excess carbon as it is entangled. So to welcome that into our body and use it as a site of investigation. I would like it if you could elaborate on that, Victoria. What is it, this toxic, maybe as well, like toxic embodiment, and what is it that we're trying to overcome and survive?
Well, it's so interesting you phrase it in that way, because like the mutation as an invitation, basically. And I do think that there's almost a demonizing of the ego in the same way that there's a demonizing of carbon dioxide. And it's not inherently bad, you know, the ego gets us to places within certain times. And I think it's about achieving a type of balance, once again, where we recognize that we're operating in this world with an ego and a spirit. And the ego almost operates like a vehicle for where we want to go. And then this spirit is, once we've arrived, now we're in that space. And there's a dialogue being created between both of them. But like Camille was saying, here's another recognition of a relationship. And in bringing art into the practice of that, what if art also was a site of a relation, just like I was explaining earlier about nature? What if art also bridges the relationships we have to the external world, the relationships we have to each other, the relationships we have to our spirit, or the relationships we have to expression? And what if those expressions are the very things that connect us to our healing and to our communities? I think even this question that you're asking today is a provocation or an invitation into that.
I really resonate with that, Victoria. I think, relationship is the key thing. And I suppose when you were saying, what are we trying to recover from? I think in a way what we're constantly seeking is to recover from this disconnect, right? Because a lot of people in the embodiment world, I guess, would say that for most of us in the West, we're kind of living from the neck up. We're like often not really even sensing what's happening in the rest of our body or paying attention to it. We're just, again, with this dualistic approach, just associating with what's here, treating our bodies like robots, not really caring about resting or even feeding ourselves properly, because the whole world around us is just telling us that this is the only thing that's real and this is what we should be paying attention to. And so with embodiment practices, it's very much around how do we start to bring in the rest of the body and to actually operate as a holistic being in relation to the world around us, to other beings. And similarly, I hope that that within art we can see maybe a movement towards addressing this separation, and thinking about what repair or reconnection could look like, and maybe building art languages or processes that allow people to feel more of a sense of belonging, rather than needing to know the codes or know the names of different artists or feel like they have the codes to participate, but could see themselves more in relationship and allow creativity to be a site of healing. That's what I hope to see more of.
I feel like the sight of the relationship always takes us back to our healing. And it's so funny, Camille, because you ended with one of my favorite quotations with the goddess, lesbian prophetess, poet, Audre Lorde, which is that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that, again, is an invitation, because what if the tool wasn't a tool, but a site of relation? What if we got to it before it was a tool? You know what I mean? Like, it takes me back to the construction of the industrial system and how there's a difference between that factory worker who created 10,000 toys to children he'll never see and a carpenter's relationship to his wood, and what is experienced within that relationship there, as opposed to the wood as the object itself. I think we underestimate what can take place within the in-between, and that's where I think we need to start living.
I totally agree.
To also look at the tool, like what happened before it became a tool. Like back to also how you mentioned in your talk, like looking at these as sites of relation, as we would look at the sugar. Where did that tool from? What is that tool, and who was involved in it to have? How did it come into the master's hands in the first place as well? To reclaim that, if anything. Do we have any questions from the audience here? Just keep raising your hands up whenever you want to intervene. And also would like to ask if there's any questions from the audience we have online. I would like to go back to a point in your presentation, Camille, on the in-between as well, what you mentioned now, Victoria, that if it's not change on a policy level and not a change on an individual level, but maybe not only though, like how does this triad, not to exclude, so we do need changes on policy levels, on individual levels, on how we react in our surroundings and consider our presence within an interrelational connections, and the in-between, the communal. If you could, like more practically within your practices, pull out examples from the workshops or from the projects that you had led, what kind of insights do you give us on acting on a triad on these three frontiers?
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'll try and think of a practical example, but I suppose to start with, I think part of the dualism that we see in like Western rationalism is this idea that it has to be a binary. It's like one thing or the other. Whereas in many other worldviews and systems, like in Yoruba cosmology, my ancestors are Yoruba too, which are an indigenous community in Nigeria. In a lot of African philosophical thought, two things can exist at the same time. Like more than two possibilities can be present. So for me, it's not that we don't need to focus on policy and we don't need to focus on individual change. It's kind of all of them need to sort of happen in connection to each other. And I think there are different ways to kind of facilitate that by, again, focusing on relationships. So I can give an example. I think in 2018, I produced a festival called Regenerate, which was thinking about drug policy and racial justice in the UK context. And I'd noticed, having done a lot of work in drug policy, I tend to be at these conferences with people who were advocating, but not actually from the communities, who were really experiencing the war on drugs in a very visceral way, being policed, being harassed on a daily basis. And so I was thinking, okay, how do we get the advocates who have the power to really, be speaking to governmental organizations to shift the legislation? How do they get into the same room as people who are being harassed by police because of suspicion of drug possession, right? And so we thought, well, what makes an enjoyable relationship possible? So we created a festival which had music, we commissioned Black artists to do a gallery space. We had workshops, including things like a death cafe, which created an environment where people from the more official drug policy world could be there, as well as people from the Southeast London community and those who maybe had experienced harassment because of the war on drugs. And so creating a container which could be accessible to a wider range of people, where they could form different relationships, which were tapping into policy, but also thinking about individual change and raising awareness around what this system is, because people who were experiencing the brunt of it might not have known the statistics or known the legislative stuff that was happening, because we wanted a space to kind of create crossover and a different dynamic. So I think that's one example of just trying to move outside of the silos and make sure that those who maybe have decision-making power can be in the same space as those who have a lived experience of something, and allowing them to have the different codes to translate and understand, oh, it's actually the same thing that we're experiencing or working on. But a lot of the time these people aren't allowed to be in the same room together. And I think these type of things could be conceptualized for lots of different areas, but that's just one example.
I think just jumping in on that, I want to give an example that isn't remedial or isn't on the basis of crises within the West, because I think the work I was talking about within the Amazon was more about cleaning up or dealing with the destruction. And some of the work that I'm doing right now is a publication where I'm going into the pre-colonial spaces of African societies, and I'm looking at those communities and spaces and the architecture specifically. And what I think is fascinating that we're not exploring enough of, or that we don't hear enough of, because the world operates on a centralized system within Western knowledge, is a lot of these pre-colonial spaces already had embedded within their infrastructure a triad of connectivity. For example, instead of our infrastructure and our transportation systems, which operate on the basis of economy, in that we go somewhere to buy something or to spend money, things like that, a lot of their movements are based on ritual, going to and from to give libations and offerings to the ancestors, for example. The architecture is created out of techniques like sun-dried adobe brick and rammed earth, which are all earthen and mud and soil materials that take from the earth and give right back to the earth, so that when the queen mother dies, for example, or she leaves, it just simply degrades again. And that creates another type of holistic and whole system. But also the infrastructure of relationships is within that as well, and gathering and community. It's not individualistic, and there's a blurring between what is private and what is public, you know? So it's fascinating to think in that way about systems who have or peoples who have already constructed those types of systems.
Would you, Rian, I'm getting a note that there is a remark or a question from people from the audience. Do you want the microphone? Online, no? On the virtual audience.
Thank you. We have maybe more of a reflection from Ellen online, who says, when I go to a masseur, not only does space and flexibility open up in my body, but it seems that information and answers are also released. Is that liberated information actually in my body, or is it the energy that is released, allowing me to be more in touch with information or wisdom outside of me?
I mean, thank you for the reflection, the question. I'm not going to say this categorically is how it is for you, Ellen, but for me, I've definitely had similar experiences, and my perception of what's going on in me is that there's a movement or an opening in the body, which then allows that information to be released from the body. That's the way I interpret it for me. But yeah, I don't want to tell you what your experience is, but I think, yeah, with the field of somatics in particular, there's a lot more practices around kind of accessing the connection between, say, anxiety or different mental health experiences you might be having, and really locating that in parts of the body, and noticing that if we work with that part of the body, then there's also potentially a change in our emotional state or the way that that mental health experience is showing up. So I think there is definitely a correlation there. something I wanted to say before, which I didn't, around your question before, Hilda, and it's kind of related to this embodiment piece, is I'm really excited that so many people are connecting to their bodies and the information within it, but I would love to see more of a kind of collective healing approach of how we as individuals can increase our capacity through these healing practices to then change the systems or the structures that actually create harm for more people. Because at the moment, the wellness and healing industry seems very much situated within neoliberalism and is sort of structured around, you know, just heal yourself and everything's fine, not looking at the external systems which continue to create harm, continue to create barriers for many people to even access things like body work or therapy to begin with. So I really love this framing that one of my teachers, Chem and Defo, talks about alchemical resilience. So using our own embodiment work to actually create more capacity to change the structures that create harm and inequality. So then it rippling from an individual to a collective, or seeing that be, as Victoria's been saying, something that's in relationship, rather than the end goal just being like, we will one day be healed. Because what does that even, I don't even know what that means really. But that's often what's being sold in a lot of embodiment work that's available today.
Yeah, also on the level of activism then, that to not go to this anthropocentric or hierarchical way of thinking that I am caring as well for the planet as something that is external from me. It is something that is within me, within us, connecting. How can, like to repeat what Victoria said, how can I heal myself if the water that I'm drinking is still intoxicated? We are not in isolation of our surroundings and other human and more than human beings around us. And I would be as well quite suspicious and a little bit always on edge and feeling a bit allergic to the appropriation of, like when we say of like when it was the, what was it, like centering meditation, or that it was constantly hijacked into a consumable, consumerist commodity by capitalist ventures, that it would again become something to be sold. And for that I would like to pose a question on what is a communication that we can, within this like loss of trust, I would say on a personal, communal level, from the South Globe to the North's continuous pillaging and exploitation and appropriation. What kind of relation there that can as well be healed? What kind of hand we could extend into these communal practices, into these rituals, into these not alternative, but in our medical systems and knowledge, ancestral knowledge that we have. Do you imagine a sort of a tools or knowledge transfusion that could happen the other way around now, from the South to the North, and in what ways and what kind of trust capacity as well, that this would not be hijacked into appropriation and consumerist package?
Could I jump in on that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, it just made me think, like, going back to the stories of the global South, which is how they like to talk about everything out of the West. The ecofeminist mantra is that the restoring of history will connect to the restoring of species, right? And just like how I explained about how there had already been an infrastructure of understanding how these things are connected in these pre-colonial societies. And when we bring those stories from the past, like you were speaking earlier, Camille, and we bring them into our future, that's how we recognize our ancestors, recognize this past, and we understand it as dialogical within our present moment. And something I was thinking about, Hilda, as you were speaking, is the problem with the language of the Anthropocene is that it likes to demonize human beings, right? Yes, there's a recognition of the destruction that we're doing, but it's a recognition to the point of distance where it doesn't actually allow us to enter the conversation. And remember, we had just spoken about how we're trying to exist at the site of the relation and at the site of the communal. And it's weird because my head immediately goes to the wellness industry and the logic around, for example, probiotics, and how something that started as good could immediately just be co-opted by industry, by the system, and how you could actually get more beneficial bacteria into your body through creating your own sauerkraut in your home than you can buy those bottles of probiotic, right? And not only that, what if you created that sauerkraut with a friend or with a family member, and you're playing your favorite Erica Badu jam, and you're filling up your soul and you're creating community around that, and you're therefore not only targeting the fact that you need to deal with your gut bacteria, but you're connecting with others, you're feeding your soul, you're releasing all these serotonins and good feelings, you're touching various aspects of life. And I think that's what holistic systems do. They don't target in the way that a vitamin targets. It works like a mushroom in that it's dialogical with its surroundings. And that's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves and work with, is that when we're working with communities, we have to be in constant dialogue within one another, because shit happens in this life and we're constantly changing. And we know this is hard, right? It's hard to work with other people because the negotiation is tough, but it's also recognizing that there's something of a loss, but always something of a gain. There's a beginning and an end, and that holistic system of seeing its beginnings and seeing its ends will immediately cancel out one and the other, because it's continuing to cycle once more.
Thank you for saying that, Victoria. I feel like, yeah, it's so much often coming into relationship. And I do think, though, Hilda, your question around how we can kind of, I guess, be in reciprocity with the so-called global south. I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment because my mom is Yoruba and born in Nigeria, but I was raised in the UK. And I went to Nigeria for the first time quite recently, and I think we just have to be aware that when we're born in the West, we just have a lot of power and access that people back home do not necessarily have. And so it's a kind of role switch, because we may have more disenfranchisement in the Western countries we grew up in, but then we go back home and we have a lot of power and access there. And I think we have to kind of, at least for me, I have to navigate the dichotomy, the bothness, and think about how maybe I could start to extract resource from the West and, you know, be in reciprocity by supporting Nigerian-born, raised projects over there, and being sort of in more of a conversation place and acknowledging I'm not going to have all the answers, because I think the conditioning we have over superiority, being grown up in the West, often means that we think, well, you know, we went to this university and we have the answers about this and this and this. But I think that's been reproducing this colonial logic, and we can sometimes get, I think, fooled by thinking, oh, this is my ancestry, or this is where I come from. But I do and I don't, right? Yes, it is my ancestry. Yes, I do want to return to the indigeneity of Yoruba ways. But there's also a lot of stuff that could potentially get prickly around that if I'm not really careful about building relationship and reciprocity in very intentional ways. So this is something I'm thinking about a lot, and I probably will continue to do so throughout my life. But yeah, I think we need new stories, but we're not necessarily gonna get there without sort of interrogating the different roles we inhabit in different spaces and the way that shifts. So I'm thinking about that a lot at the moment.
Thank you. That resonates as well with me on always being considering like which positions that you take based on which resources that you have at the moment, and the distribution as well, always making this distribution of wealth, of privileges, and acknowledging that as well, and using it to what ends. Are there any further remarks from our audience here or online anybody went to a massage salon and experienced. I love that question from Ellen. No, so real that what does come up across when you're investigating, and how are we equipped and like also communally to it felt like opening a radio station of like people who would say, hey, I'm experiencing this, and sharing that with others when things come up. This information that we're not perhaps expecting to be released, or where does it come from? Could I have inhabited that all along?
I think it's just learning to listen, because I feel like the body has its own language, and it's not the language of thought, it's the language of sensation. But if we don't prioritize listening to sensation, then we're not learning the language of the body. You know, people, I have a headache, take a paracetamol. I understand sometimes you might need to do that, but that's a signal. It's not random. It's your body trying to tell you something. So I think we're very acculturated to bypassing the signals, not listening to them. But they're quite subtle, but they're definitely there. So sometimes when you do have an embodied experience with a massage or acupuncture or something, it may be that there's more dropping in and ability to start noticing the subtle cues that maybe aren't as available when we're moving through the very busy, bright, distracting worlds that we live in. Just a thought. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Camille.
Cool.
I mean, just based on what you were saying there, like learning to listen to these subtle feelings, but also what does listening mean? I wonder that sometimes, because you know, you have those moments where you're like, why do I feel so anxious right now? And yes, you question it, but what's the doing in the listening? Like, what does it mean to active listen? Because there's something so unsettling about just like sitting there with that anxiety. Like, what happens next?
I think it depends on the day. At least for me, it really depends on the day. I think there's a practice, again, coming back to Adrienne Marie Brown, who I think is just a brilliant human being. She really emphasizes needing to practice things. And for many of us, if we're not used to sitting in an uncomfortable feeling, it might mean that doing that for more than 1 minute, 2 minutes might be way too much and is overwhelming. But if we could get in the habit of practicing, I'm noticing this uncomfortable sensation. What would it be like if I breathed into it? Could I do it for 10 seconds? Oh, okay. And just to get a little bit more information, just to notice it and to see if that noticing creates any shifts, I think can be something that's quite powerful to start doing. I think because we're more and more operating like we're machines, you know, trying to be productive all the time, sometimes when difficult emotions or sensations come up, we want to bypass them or shut them down. I don't have time for this right now. I need to go to work, or I need to collect my kids, or I need to, whatever it might be. It's like not convenient. And so maybe the practice is trying to create, when it's possible, just a bit more space to notice, to not immediately need it to go away or to be something else, but to try and understand what it's asking and what the information could be. And sometimes even just noticing it and doing some breathing or giving the body some touch and some presence and being in that moment can actually do a lot. So I think, to me, that's one way of beginning a practice of the listening. But I think it takes time, and it is challenging when we're constantly being corralled to move away from anything that's uncomfortable or not convenient to our productive capacities. So that's the first thing that comes up in terms of how maybe we could lean into that listening a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because like that listening kind of becomes a question of what if. Like we spoke about curiosity and exploration. Like, what if I just leaned into that? What if I did this? And both as dancers, that kind of reminds me of something I was talking with the students, actually. We were exploring this choreographer named Trajal Haral, and he created this amazing dance piece where he took the movements of what was happening in upstate New York in the 80s with this like postmodern movement of breaking traditional ballet forms. And then he joined it with what was happening in the south of New York, which was voguing. And he said, what if these two movements had just met? And through that question of what if, he created this entirely new choreography and an entirely new way of moving. And I think, wow, look at how he created something so new just based on that question. But something that scares us as a human society is asking the question of what if and not receiving a product or a solution, right? Like, that's the risk right there. But then what if it does work? What if we keep on trying? And there's something so beautiful about asking that.
Yes. It resonates so much. I think that sometimes there's an urgency that we experience that maybe is just part of capitalism, the scarcity and urgency. We always feel there's not enough, or we always feel we need to have an answer right now. And so sometimes, whether it's about climate crisis or around racial justice, a sense of like, well, what do we do? What's going to fix it? It's like, I don't know. We have to work it out. We have to be in the questioning and the curiosity and try things. Maybe say, does this work? How do we know? Okay, maybe not. Let's pivot. Let's try this then. But actively be in that exploration, because what isn't going to get us anywhere is a sense of either needing one answer right now or just saying, well, nothing's going to work and we stay where we are. We have to kind of be feeling into and iterating and allowing ourselves to get in the mess of that. And it might not be comfortable, and sometimes we're going to get it wrong. But I think this desire for knowing, for understanding immediately, is actually to our detriment in a really big way. And so even on an embodied level, on the micro, it might be, well, this confuses me and I don't know where it's going to lead, so I won't be with it. But how do we cultivate curiosity internally so that we have a practice which maybe allows us to do that more easily in the collective with others? It's very connected, even though they might not seem it, but I feel like they're the same. It's the same impulse, just in different expressions.
Yeah. I mean, like, in so many ways, like, I'm thinking about how that what if and that leaning into it also creates more emotions or more feelings for the potential of, for example, guilt and shame, right? Like, those are two emotions that we feel in our current society whenever we're exploring something, whenever there's a type of uncertainty. But it's still asking on top of those questions, okay, I'm just going to experiment over here now, and I'm going to move over here now. And just as you were speaking, I was thinking about like improvisation practices as well, and connecting that to nature. Like, I imagine fungi, this mycelial network moving throughout the soil, just like improvising and like doing various movements and working with crisis as an opportunity. And that's the choreography, right? Crisis as an opportunity.
Totally. And that's so much around how I think our communities have survived, how migrant communities and Afro-diaspora communities have survived through so much challenge. Is that improvisation, that ability to be present with and say, oh no, we need to pivot. Okay, we're here, we experience the joy. Oh, this is happening, let's pivot. And that ability, and you see that through our dance, through jazz, through music, the expression, the improvisation is part of the lineage. And I think it's incredibly important. And rigidity, I don't think is going to get us through the challenges that we face as a global community. So whether it's improvisation in dance or in music or in embodied exploration, I think is a really, necessary thing for us as societies to get more adept with. Because we're going to have to be flexible and navigate who knows what, hopefully lots of joy as well, but I think there are definitely some challenges to come, and we're going to need to be experimental with it.
Okay, first I want to say thank you. I'm really happy that I'm here and that we're here. It was very funny because I was very nervous to like ask a question, and I felt my heart like beating very hard. I have that for some reason when I'm gonna take a microphone. But then Camille started talking about like breathing and like leaning into it, and I was like, oh, okay, I'm gonna do that. It actually helped. It kind of faded away, so thank you for that. And my question is actually about the tinctures that Victoria was talking about, because I'm a herbalist, and I was born in Costa Rica and moved here a couple of years ago, and I actually feel like my body is more prone to allergies since I moved here. So I'm actually really interested in how you made the tinctures and what exact mushroom you used to make them. Yeah.
Well, the first thing I would say, just because you're prone, wait, you guys can hear me, right? Okay. Just because you're prone to allergies, actually, one of the first things that I usually do whenever I'm traveling is as soon as I land in a new locality, I always take a tablespoon of the local honey, because bees populate various plants and flowers throughout the region. So you're taking in a type of like similarity, you're expanding through the bee. And so my system, somehow it always helps. It just becomes used to the landscape through that bee. And so I would recommend that. But specifically the mushrooms that we were working with, or the fungi we were working with, were 3 various types of medicinal mushrooms, which is the reishi and the cordyceps and the lion's mane. And if you are really prone to allergies, I would recommend even trying out reishi if you would like. Lion's mane, I would say, is more for the nervous system. It really helps me when I'm working in intense spaces or an intense moment, like right now. And yeah.
Thank you too. See, we do need to make a radio show, cooking show, that kind of communal ground. But thank you both so much also for your last comment on the spectrum of time as well, on like how you said in your presentation, you mentioned something that really touched me, that you're envisioning yourself being an ancestor as well. We don't only like look at our ancestors, but also visualizing yourself as well being an ancestor to generations to come. So all experimentations and shape shiftings and listening is placed on a whole time spectrum that comes in, not this immediate product oriented, answer driven immediacy. That is really a symptom of our times. So thank you so much, both of you, for your interventions, both Victoria and Camille.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this would be the end of our first session for today. And at 4 o'clock, we are having as well 2 guests, one physical in the space and one remote. So I'd invite you to join to that. The session is called How to Move Forward during the 6th extension, with Thomas Moynihan and Alison Sperling. So please feel welcome to join us back at 4 o'clock. And thank you so much for being present in physical space and remotely. And thank you again for our technical team and the Fiber Festival. Thank you so much, Camille and Victoria.
Thanks.